Hello, everyone. I'd first like to thank Zilka Joseph and Professor Cole and everyone involved at the Center for South Asian Studies, and most especially to our donor for making this incredible experience that I had available to me. So thank you. I will click open up. Okay. All right, so again, my name is Julia Field, and I looked into education and globalization in rural Punjab. Just real quick about me, I'm a junior, I'm majoring in anthropology and urban studies, and before this opportunity, I'd only been to Canada and Honduras for 1 week, so I definitely fit under the criteria of never really having traveled before, which this fellowship kind of specifically targeted, so I'm very grateful for this opportunity. All right, so education and globalization were very ambitious topics, but I kind of just wanted to be able to observe what I'd read about in classes, which was I knew that education could be used as a tool for empowerment, and I wanted to see that firsthand in another country. And also I assumed that in some way this education was being affected by globalization, and I kind of wanted to see how. So those were the main reasons I had wanted to look into these topics while there. And in doing so, I worked with Educare India, which is a non-governmental organization in Northwest India, which is in Punjab, while I was there. They're a developmental NGO that, at the end of their mission statement there, they work to create prosperity in rural Punjab through spreading awareness and information, education, and developing skills and employment opportunities. They're a relatively new organization, and they started in 1994, but they didn't actually implement projects to 2004. So they're definitely developing, and that was obvious to me, and they had a lot more to go, but it was neat to see their progress while I was there. It's an interesting organization in that it's almost entirely made up of international interns. They only had 2 Indian nationals who ran the whole thing, and then everyone else was an intern who came for 2 months to 2 years. They had 3 centers in 3 rural villages, all about 30 minutes apart by Indian buses, which I mastered by the end of my time there. And I would say there's about 20 to 40 community members from each, where each village was, that were involved in the programs the centers had running. So I specifically worked with the Marginalized Communities Empowerment initiative they had there, and within that there was an after-school program for migrant children and also a girls' club. I also observed the Institute for Global Awareness, which was essentially just English language classes, and that helped me kind of learn more about, was speaking to those students about globalization in that area. And finally, they also had other programs such as waste management, an organic farm, health education, and micro-lending. So because this is a brief presentation today, I'm just going to focus on what I observed at the girls' clubs while I was there. We generally had probably about 10 to 20 girls, ages 8 to 20. The older ones usually worked as translators for us. Most of the girls only spoke Punjabi or Hindi and very little English. But the main point of the girls' clubs were those are the goals there from the website, from Educare's website, was to build leadership skills within the girls and boost their self-esteem. To educate them about health, also to provide recreation, fun and games, but most importantly to give them a space, because they didn't always have that in their own communities, to just come as a group of girls and share and talk. And then the main goals were to promote gender equality and create a sense of independence for these girls. Let's see. You can see there, Martha and I, just so you know, we went to the same area and worked alongside the same organization, but we did different projects. But here you can see we did units with the girls on nutrition. So they would learn English words for food. Well, they'd also, our translator would give them in Punjabi as well. And they'd have to make a healthy plate of food. So they had fun activities. And then we also tried to work on, we would teach them about our cultures and they would teach us about theirs. So we did some Punjabi dance lessons. And here's one of those. But overall, I saw some risks with the program. There was a dependency on the interns who, because they were only there for a short amount of time after they left, the girls' clubs would change a lot and there wasn't a lot of continuation, which I think really kind of hurt the progress for what they were working for, the long goal of equality in general and getting out to the whole community. And then the whole English thing was definitely a a challenge because some of the girls did not speak English, and the ones who did usually had more money and they were able to afford the private education where they learned English in their schools. So there's weird power dynamics involved with that. And also some of the lessons did not translate well because the interns were not very properly, I think, well informed before coming to Punjab by the organization. And like in the nutrition lesson, someone talked about meat, and a lot of the girls were really perturbed by that because they're vegetarians. But then someone else accidentally brought up beef, which was really not appropriate. So the girls were not happy. But successes overall, they started a poetry club, which was a really neat way for the girls to express themselves and actually really worked on their English skills because when they could write it out and think about it, they could do it much better than just being put on the spot and having to answer in English, spoken English. And also for the girls to see females traveling abroad, which, you know, all the girls, the interns leading the girls' clubs were females. Like that was really inspiring to them because they might not be allowed to do that, but to see the others who could, I think that was really neat for them. And finally, what I thought was most important is it gave them their own space, which they did not always have. All right, excuse me. And then I also worked with the Migrant Empowerment Program. The migrants in the area where Educare worked with at least, were the trash picker migrants, they're snake charmers, and also agricultural migrants. They're mostly from Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and other parts of Punjab. And there was a real problem where they were not very integrated with the greater community in which they lived, and they faced a lot of discrimination. And also, more specifically to what I was looking into, they had very few educational opportunities. They would have to go to public school because they didn't have money to afford private schooling. And it was often, the public schools in that area were very underfunded, understaffed, and it wasn't ideal. So with Educare, they run an after-school program for the migrant children. They worked on like educational worksheets that focused on basic math and English skills and like, geography, stuff that wasn't always touched on in their schools. And it was tailored for each group of kids they would work with. They also played games, and like I said, this was important because their schooling wasn't the best, and also a lot of the children had to stay home and work either like as a trash picker with their family or also in the fields if they're from a migrant agricultural worker family. Overall, I think this was a very successful program. The children responded really well because they really appreciated the attention that they got from the interns. To have someone who cared about their education was kind of unusual sometimes, and they really appreciated that. It also helped Educare form a good relationship with the mothers and fathers within the migrant community, which helped them pursue other stuff they were working towards, which was sanitation and health access within those communities. And again, the overall idea was to integrate the migrants into the greater community of the village where they lived in. And I think while I was there, I saw very slow steps towards that, but steps nonetheless. But again, risks the dependency on the interns who would leave after their stay there. And also the migrants had a lot of mistrust for the interns because they thought they were working for the government, understandably so. So this is just a picture of one of the camps where we worked at. During the summer, it was very hot because they just had the black tarps and it was all open. So like not the worst conditions in the world, but definitely not ideal either. And then, like I said, the students or the migrant children really responded well to the program that Educare had running, and they would come to the office to ask for extra worksheets to do. And one time I tried to play jump rope with some of the kids, and they asked for playing ABCs instead. So I thought that was pretty cool that they'd rather be working on stuff than playing with, jump rope. So, like I said, I also worked a little bit with observing the English classes they had running there. And this was actually a really neat opportunity to learn from, the students enrolled in the English classes were from like middle-class families. And so I got to hear from them like their own opinions on like, their own culture. And so I learned about women's role there and how it was very clear to them that, baby boys were preferred over the girl babies, and just the inequality they faced was interesting to hear. Then I also heard about their views of the migrant workers, and they would say like I was working with wonderful people, but they would say the worst things about the migrants who I was also working with, and that was really discouraging. And it showed me like what steps had to be taken to further, the integration there. And I learned a little bit about village politics, which was very fascinating. And finally, they also taught me a little bit more about the globalization that they saw in their daily life. So I was in a very rural area where you wouldn't see anything like this, but I would go 2 hours on a bus and I would be in Chandigarh, and then I'd be in this like French cafe and I'd see this Vogue with like kind of a risque image that would not at all be appropriate where I lived. And so to see that transition was really, it was a stark transition. And I know that my students, the English students, like kind of had to grapple with that too. So like through them, I kind of learned how they were taking the transition of their more traditional culture to like influences of Western culture. And like, I don't know, they had this urge to kind of accept them, or to accept the Western culture because that's what they wanted to get abroad often. So I don't know, that was very fascinating, but also sad to see them working through that. Again, this is just like an example. This is an hour away from where I lived, and there's a McDonald's and like this mall, and it's just very different. And then, like I said, there was this, many of the students wanted to go abroad eventually, so that's why they were in the English classes, and you saw these advertisements everywhere. So I think a lot of them struggled with being proud of their own culture, but also like wanting to become more Western because sometimes they thought they were backward because of like their traditional culture. So there was a lot of difficulties for them there, and I guess overall it was difficult to come to a conclusion because it was not my culture. Like I can't quite say how it has changed exactly due to globalization, but I could definitely tell that it has had an effect and will continue to have an effect on the people I worked with for a while to come. So that's it, and thank you again, donor and everyone else.
Hello, everybody. Bring this down. Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandria, and today I'm going to be talking about my research topic, which was associations of leg length with adult cardiometabolic risk and childhood social circumstances. And of course, my research wouldn't have been possible without the generosity of the donor. And thank you so much for your help, Zilka and Professor Cole. So I have to figure out where I should stand. My research was done at the Public Health Foundation of India, and that was in New Delhi. And my first host family, we were outside of New Delhi, and Mrs. Mahanti on the left there was fluent in English. And then afterwards, I lived inside of New Delhi city, and Auntie Bhagwan spoke no English. So that was an experience. So leg length. Leg length is a very popular biomarker among scientists as a way to assess a person's health. Why is that? Leg length, first of all, has been shown to be able to predict a person's health in the future. And secondly, we found that total height and leg length is a very good way for extrapolating information about your health as a child. But this has only been shown in developed nations. When we look at developing nations or nutritionally stunted populations, we found a lot of inconsistencies. A study was done previous to my study in India that leg length was completely useless as a biomarker. So there's a lot of discrepancies in the data. So I had two questions for my research project. Is leg length better than height for predicting your health in the future? And a proxy that we used for future health is cardiometabolic risk. And I'll explain later what this big phrase means. My second question was, is leg length better than height at finding out about a person's health when they were a little kid? And a proxy for childhood health was childhood social circumstances, basically childhood socioeconomic status. So why is this important? What's the big picture? Well, in developing nations and underprivileged populations, people don't have a very good chance or opportunity at accessing good health care. And usually people in poor countries, poor populations, they don't have medical records handy to show to a doctor. In severe cases, they don't exactly have a birth certificate to show either. So if we can unlock the use of leg length in assessing a person's health, we can really help empower the patient because they'll be able to go in there and the doctor will know in what sense of what risk they are at and what they've already experienced. So where we got our data from was from the Indian migration study. It's a gigantic database that's the numbers are just sitting there to be analyzed. And the objective of the Indian migration study, which was run through my institute, but I didn't really have anything to do with the IMS. Their objective was to look at the impact on health from migrating from rural villages to urban cities. So what they did was they collected health information from 4 different cities, 4 different factories in different cities, Lucknow, Nagpur, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And they collected information on the factory worker, they collected information on their spouse, and then they traced and found their rural dwelling sibling. So we have a really big geographic range of database that we can use. So what did we do with these numbers? How did we crunch them? Basically what we looked at, we took a height and leg length, and we correlated it to quantified variables of cardiometabolic risk, cardiometabolic outcomes, and their childhood socioeconomic status. So what does that look like? It looks like these big fancy tables here. And the cardiometabolic outcomes that we looked at were hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and high cholesterol. And for risk, we looked at a person's blood pressure, their cholesterol levels, their fatty levels, and their blood glucose levels. And how could we assess a person's socioeconomic status? There's an index called the Standard of Living Index. And basically, you look at a person's stuff, what resource do they have access to, and we adapted the index to Indian cities and Indian rural villages. So we just kind of use that index to place people in low, middle, high socioeconomic status. And again, we correlated those numbers to height and leg length. So I had 2 main findings. First is that when you have shorter legs, you're at a higher risk for bad health. And when you have a taller person, that person probably had a better childhood socioeconomic background. And this is the part where I say, just because you're short, just because you're tall, doesn't mean you have bad or good health. A lot of our numbers were adjusted for many different things: age, gender, where people lived, all sorts of things. So please don't make any judgments today. So when we look back at the 2 questions that I asked, I had a conclusion that yes, leg length is better than height at extrapolating information about a person's health in the future. And this is great because this lines up with data that we found in developed nations, but we have to be careful because when we crunch the numbers, it was affected by if the person was obese and the current socioeconomic status. And we also found there were huge differences if we looked at males or if we looked at females. And for my second question, we found that no, leg length is not necessarily better than height at finding out information about our health as a child. But again, we have to be very careful because there were differences in the genders. And due to the objective of the Indian migration study, the people that we were sampling, their backgrounds were very similar. They probably all were children from rural villages. So the answers that we found only raised even more questions. And what we found is if we were to repeat the study, we really need a better proxy for childhood health. Right now, what we did was we looked at childhood socioeconomic status, but it seems to be kind of confounding a lot of our numbers. And another obvious fix that we have to make is we have to have a bigger sample of people. We have to have more people who had different childhood backgrounds. And third, we noticed that we have to understand better the interplay of gender and the adult socioeconomic status on their numbers. And this is the part where I say that my professor and I are actually still crunching the numbers. So a lot of my conclusions are semi-conclusive right now. And I'd like to extend a warm thank you from myself and Professor Shobhadit Day. We're hoping that by the end of the year, we'll be able to publish our findings in the International Journal of Epidemiology. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sonia Saman. I'm a senior this year studying international studies and political science. And my internship was on the empowerment of women through self-help groups. I interned in India from around the beginning of July until mid-August in Kanpur, India. And this is a picture of one of the self-help groups that I interviewed. So just to get started, my fellowship goals were primarily to research and see firsthand how the water crisis is affecting parts of India, and then to also experience working in a non-governmental organization and developing a deeper understanding of how they function. I wanted to include this picture because I thought it allowed the audience to see kind of the environment that I was working in, and I thought it was really interesting. This was actually an area that I was supposed to be conducting an interview in that day, but because of the monsoons, we couldn't actually take the road to the slum community that I was supposed to be going to, but I thought it really helped illustrate the area that I was working in. So just to give a background of the city, so Kanpur is located in northern India. It's on the southern bank of the Ganges River, and it is one of the biggest cities and considered a commercial capital in the state of Uttar Pradesh. It had a tremendous population growth after 1961, when many people living in rural communities moved to Kanpur because of the growth of the leather tannery business. And internationally, Kanpur is now known for the high amount of leather tanneries in the area, as well as the enormous amount of pollution that is caused by the presence of these tanneries. And I wanted to include that picture because I thought it was a pretty interesting depiction of what you might see just driving around in Kanpur. So to give an overview of the NGO that I worked with, Shamrak Bharti, it was established in 1986, and it's a grassroots organization. So it was created by a handful of members from the local community. That was something really interesting to me because I had the privilege of getting to know and work with two of the founders. And in their own words, Shamrak Bharti's mission is to organize the poor to come out of their poverty with a particular emphasis on empowering women in disadvantaged communities. Currently, even though Shamrak Bharti is a relatively new organization, they are assisting upwards of 50,000 families through their work in 125 slums in 13 rural areas. And although I'll be primarily focusing on the water and sanitation program, they actually had various programs, so some relating to microfinance, livelihood promotion, community health, and grassroots democracy. This is a picture from one of their livelihood promotion projects, which I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to include it in the PowerPoint because it shows how they utilized a holistic approach in really approaching the communities that they worked with. This one specifically provided free classes on sewing to young men and women in the communities. And sewing is a really valuable asset in Kanpur because of the leather tannery business. So it increased the likelihood of them being able to get jobs. And then another thing that they did that I thought was really interesting is they used leather scraps that the leather tannery businesses had already thrown out to for the students in the sewing classes. So I thought that was really interesting. And then the water crisis specifically in Kanpur. So access to clean water is hard to come by for a lot of Indians, but one thing about Kanpur that's unique is that it's not necessarily a lack of water that's a problem, but rather that the high cluster of leather tanneries in the city produce vast amounts of pollution that affect the air, water, and soil. So there's 400 leather tanneries in Kanpur, and they're primarily located on the bank of the Ganges River in an area called Jajmu. It's a double-edged problem because the tanneries consistently drain a lot of water from the river, and they also filter contaminants into the Ganges. In addition to that, there's also sewage coming from the leather tanneries and even domestic household sewage that flows directly into the Ganges River. And in a study in April 2008 by Shamrik Barthi, they found that in 30 slums of Jajmu, quality of water was a concern in every single slum. And additionally, open defecation was practiced in 23 slums. There was massive drainage problems that were an issue in 9, and scarcity of water heavily affected 26 of the 30 slums. This is a picture of one of the slums that I went to and I worked in. It's just as soon as you drove into the community, this is what you would be seeing. But now to get started on the self-help groups portion and how they play in. So Shamrik Barthi employs a coordinator for every single slum that they work in, and this coordinator is in charge of getting to know individuals in the slum community, and they organize them into groups. These groups have membership that varies between 8 and 20 women, and all of the women are over the age of 18 and are married. And that I was interested in, but they explained to me how that ensures that there's some stability in the group by lessening the chance that the women will move after they've already taken out a large loan without paying it back. So the main focus of these self-help groups is to serve as miniature legislative bodies in each slum, and they democratically elect their leadership, so their president, their vice president, their secretary and treasurer, and they collectively determine a time and place to meet, as well as a standard amount of money to collect per family. So what these funds do is they allow the women to lend out money to individual members in their self-help group, as well as to community projects at an interest rate of 1.5%. This interest rate greatly contrasts the one that they'd be able to get from loan sharks for necessary expenditures on hospital or doctor visits, children's school tuition fees, and things relating to that. So one thing that I thought was interesting, someone asked me, would self-help groups be able to work in the U.S.? And I questioned that because one of the reasons that I think that they were able to work so well in the community that I was in was because of the high level of accountability that there was. All of the members in a self-help group live extremely close together, and they know sort of the daily ins and outs of their neighbors' lives. So they can make sure that if a member asks for a loan request, that they're asking about it for a truthful reason. They couldn't just say, my child broke his leg, because their neighbors would know. So that really ensures that they're asking when they truly need the money, and that it's also ensuring that they will pay it back. And many of the women described personal benefits that they derived from their participation, but there was also a lot of public benefits. I'll be touching on them more later, but to briefly get into them, they were able to get communal bathrooms and showers, sewage systems, government funding for the construction of houses and elementary schools, and the creation of nearby water hand pumps. But the biggest thing that I was really interested in was the fact that they were able to find sort of a new voice. So self-help groups in Kanpur, they started in one slum with around 10 individuals, and it's now grown to have 160 self-help groups with over 3,000 members in Kanpur. And there's so many that they were actually able to form their own non-governmental organization, which I thought was phenomenal. And the picture that I have up here is actually the very first self-help group that I interviewed, and they were the ones who explained all of this to me. So typical projects for self-help groups. All of the things I have listed up here, but one thing that I thought was really phenomenal about these self-help groups is that prior to the women's participation in them, they could only take out loans, or they would only take out loans if there was absolute dire need, because the interest rates were so high that they would be in debt for the rest of their lives. So that made it really, really difficult for these women to be able to make payments for things that we would consider necessary, but for them, they really had to prioritize and decide. So a lot of these things are things that we don't really think about, but they were able to do, which they might not have beforehand. And then, so this is a picture of one of the slum communities that the outskirts of one of the slum communities that I went to and did some work in. And this was where they had just started the self-help group, and one of the first things that they were interested in starting was trying to get communal bathrooms, because this was actually their bathroom. So that's just to kind of give you guys a sense of the work that I was researching and the communities that these people were living in. So benefits of self-help groups. There's definitely all of these benefits up here, and I thought that it was really interesting to think about how options was one of the benefits that self-help groups allowed for. So they no longer had to take out an interest rate at 10% and be in debt for the rest of their life. They were able to come together and be empowered, have a unified voice in their slum communities. They had access to resources through Shamrock Barthi, and they were able to really exhibit ownership in their own communities. And then to sort of go more in depth in some of the benefits, specifically relating to women's empowerment, I asked one of the women that I interviewed, what do you think has primarily changed in your life since you've joined a self-help group? And what she explained to me via the translator was peace of mind that I have never experienced before. Now if my husband gets injured at work and needs to go to the hospital, I know that there is money available for us to use that we can actually pay back. If I need money to pay for my child's school tuition, or if our roof falls in, I have this peace of mind that I've never had before. My huge fear of not being able to pay back a loan to cover an emergency is now gone. So really, as you can see from that quote, there's a much greater sense of stability in their communities because of this. Another thing that I was really interested in learning about was that there was a newfound respect that these women were able to gain in their households because of their participation in self-help groups. So because they had access to funding, they were able to gain more respect by their husbands, and a lot of the women talked about how domestic abuse really decreased after they joined these self-help groups because their husbands realized and knew that they could they really needed to treat their wives well if they were hoping to reap some of the benefits that they could bring in. And then another thing is because women had more control of some of the money, they talked about how their husbands were no longer able to misuse money for alcohol or cigarettes and things of that nature. So I thought that was also interesting to note. And this picture, unfortunately, the lighting's a little low, but I thought it was a really beautiful experience. One of the last self-help groups that I interviewed was in a school area, so you see sort of the children peering through, and it was just really beautiful. They started singing a song, and it was about sort of the hardships that they had gone through, and I just thought it was really inspirational, so I included it here. And then just to sort of go into improvements in water and sanitation specifically, there is a huge difficulty in breaking existing behavioral and environmental setbacks in water, sanitation, and hygiene. But I was able to see firsthand and then also to look at a lot of research about how the self-help groups and Shamrock Barthi were able to come together and restore 19 hand pumps in 17 slums. They constructed 24 household latrines and community toilets, 46 household wastewater soak pits, and they were able to do testing for fecal contamination in various slums and found that out of 22, 14 water sources tested positive. Those were tests that hadn't been done previously, but they were also, this testing allowed for them to realize that they needed to use water chlorination techniques to sanitize the water, which they were able to do after being aware of that. And one thing that I also thought was great was the success of these initiatives was actually clear because there was a definite reduction in diarrhea and worm infestations among children. And then another approach that they took, which I thought was really interesting, is that they had awareness campaigns going on, and there was 8 participating schools with upwards of 2,000 children that held a competition on hygiene education, and it was creatively used to increase youth awareness on good hygiene practices. They also had a menstruation hygiene awareness camp that 320 adolescent girls participated in to combat the cultural taboo against dialogues around menstruation. That was really, really interesting to hear about and see because unlike our culture, where it's something that's talked about and a lot of times women often know, a lot of these young girls were explaining to me how they had no idea what was happening and they were really terrified. So I think awareness campaigns like that really showed how these self-help groups knew what problems they had and knew what changes needed to be made. Another thing that these self-help groups and Shamrock Barthi were able to do is help lobby for a solid waste collection group called A to Z, and they were able to provide benefits to households by picking up basically trash, but they made it affordable to the different areas that they went to. So all groups, regardless of their socioeconomic status, were able to benefit from this organization. And then this picture here is of a hand pump at a children's school, which was fixed by the Selfhelp group in the area. They were able to come together and petition for it through Water Aid America and get funding to implement it there. And then lastly, for my conclusion, one thing that I kept thinking about when I was trying to tie this all together was the quote that I feel like everyone's heard of. If you give a man a fish for a day, he will eat for a meal, but teach a man to fish and he will eat for a lifetime. That's something that I feel like I really saw every day in my work there, and I was really, really impressed to see how they sort of had the actions to back up their words and using a holistic approach that empowered the local community to become much more sufficient. And the success of that, I felt, was demonstrated through the greater gender equality as well as overall living conditions and peace of mind that these women and their families were able to take part of. So this is a picture of one of the last self-help groups that I interviewed, and I just take it as it inspires me a lot because of the changes that they were able to make in their own lives and in their communities. And so I'd just like to thank the donor and the Center for South Asian Studies for their generosity and to help in granting me this opportunity. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all the guests, my mother, my good friends. I really appreciate everyone coming here, Professor Cole. And I also want to echo Professor Cole's sentiment in thanking our generous donor for investing in us as people, and instead of just, buildings and things like that. I definitely felt very rewarded after this experience, and I think I'd definitely do the same thing if I ever had the opportunity. So I want to definitely thank you for that. So my name is Nader Hakim. I'm a senior now, majoring in psychology, and I got to go to Mysore, India, research about sources of information among male youth regarding sexual health and sexual risk behaviors. So some background, starting the program off, I was very interested in India, just kind of this exotic place that would be nice to go to. So I got to know, there's actually a visiting scholar here who, her and her husband had established this public health research institute in Mysore, India. So they have an associated women's health initiative. So the person you see there in the yellow is Dr. Purnima Madhivanan, and she's one of the co-founders of the institute. And you can see her there working with some youth. So they have this associated women's health initiative, and on the right there you can see some of the amazing work that they do, screenings, actually treating people. So it's very, very valuable. So I got in touch with them, and they said, we definitely like to accommodate and see if you can help us. So they both mentioned that they have very, very little information regarding men's sexual health. This clinic is meant to address some oppression that women may face and thus receive less attention, but they very much acknowledge the need for men to receive attention, things like that. So they have a lot of literature regarding women's sexual health, but not much, around men. So they figured this would be something that I could do. So it's kind of a broad, introduction to go into where to start and begin with and things like that. So again, they had very little information to go off of. So the first thing that we thought of that would help is what are they learning, what do they know, and how is this affecting what they do? Is there any correlation between that? So this was the main scientific process that we had to establish, seeing if there was any correlation between sources of information and sexual risk behavior. So again, I was in Mysore, which is in the very southern state of Karnataka there. A couple pictures. And Mysore is very unique in that it has a little bit of both of the rural and urban feels that you might see in India. So I felt like because I got to visit Delhi, and I didn't get to see any very rural places in India, but I felt like I was kind of in a very good mixture between the two places. So I think I got a very good experience. So what we did, it was all qualitative methods. So we did in-depth interviews. We recruited youth from, actually these are young men ages 18 to 25 from local colleges and things like that thought, could contribute to the study. So it was in-depth interviews ranging from as short as 30 minutes to as long as half an hour. They're very much informal. We had the structure and things like that of the interview guide, but kind of just want to get a general sense and let the conversation go to learn as much as possible. And that's the structure that you have with in-depth interviews. You kind of are the student, and the participant is the teacher, and you want to gain as much information from them as possible, excuse me. So these are kind of the flow of the interview guide that we used. Started with sources of information, touched upon school sex education, and then we've also heard a common theme in our presentations is the issue of gender in India, sexual health services, and just to kind of avoid any confounding variables in the process, the recurring technique we used was to always question the origin of any knowledge that the participants had. So we kind of had the hypothesis going in to be that lack of structured education via schools and good government services and things like that would lead to more risk behavior. So we didn't want to necessarily imply that into interview guides. We tried to be as neutral as possible in the questioning. And so, for example, if a participant mentioned some norm they noticed in society, we just asked where they learned that from instead of kind of implying to them, did you learn this from, would you have gotten this better from school, for example. So we wanted to get, avoid that confounding variable and things like that. So again, with the qualitative methods, we transcribe all the interviews, look for recurring themes, and that is the significant data that we can go off of. So these are two primary people involved. That's me and Dr. Reshma Shaheen. Got to work very closely with her, and she was really, really wonderful and extremely helpful. So she was an advisor. She kind of had obviously she lived in India. She had, she knew what was going on, a ton of help with recruiting. And in cases where the participants did not speak English very well, she would help interpret and things like that. So again, most of the participants did speak English, and like I mentioned that was definitely a limitation of the study. So preliminary findings, what we learned. So question we would ask, for example, is where do you learn about sexual health and things like that? And the main umbrella term that you could use for this is media. So newspapers, TV, movies, and a good amount actually mentioned that they would literally Google for answers. So this was kind of surprising, and it was really telling. And we can all kind of assume Google's improving and it gets us some reliable sources, but we can all imagine the kind of possibilities for discrepancies in information that you can get from just doing a simple Google search. This was a very real answer that wasn't prompted or anything like that. This is what they actually said. And another source was friends. So friends who were sexually active or friends who somehow had a structured education, this is what they would learn from. And what kind of became the emphasis of the study was the lack of school sex education. And again, we tried not to imply this to the students that this is what we kind of hypothesized would happen, but it kind of naturally came out in the in-depth interviews that this is what was happening. We wish we had school sex interviews. They would go so far as to mention that teachers would feel they would be in the curriculum, but teachers out of shyness would prefer to skip over the chapter and not mention it. So this was a very real finding that we had. And so we also did some kind of see the correlation in actual sexual activity. And this is also very, kind of also limitation of the study, and that these aren't completely anonymous. It's a qualitative method. We're doing in-depth interviews. They're obviously telling someone. So given the taboo regarding sexual activity and sexual health, we didn't directly ask participants about their sexual activity. We more asked, what do you think your friends are doing? What is the general norm in society? So India, in general, we speak in generalizations, is more conservative in regards to sexual activity. So not so much, and most of it is contained within marriage structure. So there is still definitely a great deal less than what you would see in a Western culture, but it's in general it is increasing. And of this practice, thankfully, it looks like the sexual activity would be covered under safe sex practices. This is something that the Indian government has, I think, succeeded in, given the AIDS crisis that was very real not too long ago and still is very real. So, safe sex practices were very heavily emphasized in India, and it seems to have been working. And the last part of the study was about sexual health services. And as we'll mention in the next slide, taboo came up a big deal. So again, we mentioned the Purana Women's Health Initiative. There are some services and some resources that people can utilize to get treatment for sexual health issues. But another recurring theme, without being prompted, the participants all mentioned that they pretty much know a general physician they could visit or a clinic they could go to, but out of a little bit of shame and fear of people finding out, they would rather let a condition go untreated than to go to a sexual health clinic and get treated. So that was very interesting. So I kind of just came up with this simple diagram just for, when I was trying to put everything together of how, all these variables are interacting and things like that. So it starts with the general taboo and discussing sexual health issues, and that leads to not discussing it. Like I mentioned, it would be dismissed in school education. So you get unreliable info from Google, from TVs that fantasize and don't give a very accurate depiction of what sexual health should look like, and that in turn leads to some unhealthy sexual behavior. So the main kind of conclusion that we came at, the recurring theme in general, it's kind of a broad one, but it's the taboo, and this is from a statement from the State AIDS Control Society's chief medical officer, and kind of mentioning that there are these local customs, and he mentioned what was learned in the in-depth interviews, that participants definitely were prevented from seeking treatment given the local customs or the taboos. So one of the important things that we wanted to do with the study is actually make it a little bit practical. So again, this was kind of new for the Institute in Mysore to learn some information about where men are learning about sexual health and sexual activity. So we wanted to come up with some strategies and things like that coming from the research. So coming off of what the students mentioned about simply not knowing what's true and what's not, most of the potential steps are focused on education, on sex education that is culturally sensitive too. And like we mentioned, I definitely noticed too with the youth, kind of having this inferiority complex with, in reference to Western society. And I think that's a bit unfortunate, because I think all of us who went to India were very much admired the culture and things like that. And like I mentioned, it is more conservative and things like that. But in general, people feel that what the Western norm is, and very kind of lax norms and things like that, that was the ideal, whereas the Indian ideal was kind of the backwards one and things like that. So mostly we want to implement educational techniques that address the taboo and kind of go around this issue in a culturally sensitive manner. And one of the things that's holding us back, and it was interesting because I had no idea, I didn't do enough research about it, because when I talked to the participants, they all mentioned that this is actually a kind of a current political hot topic, is sex education in schools and things like that. So I think more research like this, showing the interest and things like that, and I just looked at, a World Health Organization study actually looked at programs from around the world to seeing if structured sex education in schools actually increased sexual activity, because that's one of the worries of the Indian society and the government, things like that. And the study showed that it did not, in fact, increase sexual activity. So one general study, I think that could be replicated specifically in India would be very useful. So examples of education, again, going with the culturally sensitive technique, namely being anonymous and being professional. So that's, phone lines with experts. A lot of participants mentioned that one technique or one avenue they would utilize is a letter to an editor in a newspaper, for example. They just write a letter to the newspaper, an expert gets back to them, and it's published for everyone to read. And that way the taboo is, and the kind of personal shame is avoided, but the education and the accurate information is readily available. And I think a big one would be to have the concrete standard curriculum available in schools and things like that, and kind of specialized training for teachers that will kind of address it in a sensitive manner. And finally, with the sexual health services, one of the things that they mentioned was if the doctor just had a little bit more was a little bit more aware of what I'd be going through and things like that. So they all mentioned that they were afraid the doctor would judge them and things like that. So I think more specialized physicians would definitely aid in making the services more attractive and accessible. So again, definitely some limitations of the study. We only covered men. Given that they were not anonymous and they were in-depth interviews, that added some discomfort for the participants. And we thought that'd be even more so if we had women participants. So we left out half the population, and that would be important to study more. It was a relatively young age group, and one of the biggest ones was that it was restricted to English-speaking participants only, given my background. And this limited, I'm sure everyone who have visited India would know that, and they mentioned English speakers are most normally in higher socioeconomic status. So this would give us definitely a different group of people. If we had, access to people in the villages who didn't speak English, I think we would have had some unique results that are worth exploring. So further research, we want to see what are the attitudes of the parents of these youth about implementing sex education. They're the ones who are kind of gonna have to approve of it and things like that. And more quantitative methods, I think at this point would help getting more significant data about what helped and what didn't with school sex education. So special thanks. All the people, these are at the bottom, these are the people that helped out in India. Dr. Reshma Shaheen. The Public Health Research Institute is very well organized, and it was a very, it was a team effort, to say the least. So that was great. I wanted to thank Ms. Zilkajofis for all her support in the process, and again to our generous donor for investing in us and investing in India. We definitely learned a lot, and I can say it was a life-changing experience. So I thank you for that very much. That is it. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Martha Johnson, and I am a junior studying economics with a focus on international economics, international trade and finance. The topic I chose for the research fellowship was microfinance, along with women's empowerment. And like Julia, I went to Punjab, India, and went to a specific NGO called Educare. So why did I choose microfinance? This has been like a global buzzword for quite a while now. It sort of all started with, well, some people would say it started with Grameen Bank, which was started by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. And then after that, it sort of spread out and culminated with an international year of microcredit in 2005. I think that was the United Nations Development Program. And after that, though, you started to see more open criticism against microfinance, like this book, Why Doesn't Microfinance Work? And this guy in the corner, professor here at our business school, Dr. Karnani, and he has argued that microfinance is actually too romantic view of the poor, expecting all poor people to be able to be their own entrepreneurs, and what they really need is just steady employment and maybe micro savings. And why women's empowerment? This intrigued me in the same way that microfinance did, because the microfinance effect is that once you get it started, it's sort of a chain, and the poor people who have access to loans can help themselves that way, and then they pay back with interest, so it's a win-win. And with women's empowerment, there's something called the girl effect, and this is also about ending the cycle of poverty. What happens, well, the explanation behind it is that not only are women an untapped resource in many developing countries, they're also responsible borrowers. That's been shown in Grameen Bank, and they are often the poorest. And also, they tend to spend a more higher proportion of their profits from the microloans on their community and on their family, and especially investing in their children's education. And of course, it's hard to research development in India without encountering the gender issues there. So this map shows the size of the country is correlated with you take the literacy rate of the men and subtract the literacy rate of women there. So in India and just over in South Asian area, you can see that there's a huge literacy gap there compared to other countries. And this gap also has to do, the way they calculated the literacy gap there also relates to the bottom image here, which has to do with the skewed sex ratio in India, because there in general just are more men, because as you can see, the shaded areas are where there are more men to women, and those are the sort of more wealthy areas where there is prenatal gender testing and selective abortion. So gender is quite a problem in India in a variety of ways. So these are just some of the institutions that have arisen in India to help women out in specifically financial ways. This bottom one is the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, which has partnered up with self-help groups, which Sonya talked about. They're both sort of government initiatives. And what happens is once the self-help groups get large enough, the linkage program links them up with a bigger bank, and they get a loan for their entire group. And on the top, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India has been around for a long time before the microfinance craziness happened. So my mindset throughout my research was to investigate the how. I wanted to see microfinance and women's empowerment happening and paying attention to just the decision making and the process of the institution where I would be. So from just preliminary research before I went there in articles and other academic literature, it was the basic strategy behind microfinance and women empowerment was pretty clear. Usually it was starting up a self-help group and lending to that group at a low interest and giving them some financial education as well. But what wasn't clear from just reading articles was sort of the behind the scenes in the organizations, like what's their decision-making process? Do they encounter any failures, and how do they learn from failures? And what exactly are the resources that the organizations need, especially the nonprofits that are trying to do this? And how long does it take before you see legitimate success? So the way I thought about it was as sort of a recipe where you want to end up with financial empowerment for women. So on the top is just a regular recipe for food. If you have a recipe and it's sort of has good ratings, like 5-star on allrecipes.com, there are still some things that you need. You need to have the ingredients to make it, and you need to determine whether it's really what you want, whether it's really like the food that you are hungering for. And so relating this to the goal of financial empowerment, not only do you need a good model for microfinance, you also need to take a look at what the available resources are to you and what exactly you're aiming for given your environment. And the key words here, I think, are the available resources. So you need to identify what is actually there available to you and what the craving is exactly in your environment, and then put those together, and you have to adapt the microfinance strategy to be most effective. So I went to Educare, and they, as far as the cravings part goes, the identifying what needs to be done, they chose almost everything, I think, in their area that they could point to and say, this is something we can address. So they had a lot on the menu, I guess. Some of their programs, they did have microfinance program and women's empowerment, but they also had the ones that Julia was mentioning before, which included like waste management, marginalized communities, and many other projects. So yeah, Educare just calls themselves in general a rural sustainable development organization. So they're located in Punjab, India. This is where we went. It's in the very top there. And these are just some scenes from around the area we were, near Hoshiarpur and Jalandhar. On the left image, you can see it's a farming district. Punjab is known sort of as the breadbasket of India. It's one of the more wealthy states. And on the right, this is just, when you're walking through cities, this is what you see on the surface is a lot of waste. And so when Educare, just looking at where they are, they see on the surface this waste management program, so they have a project addressing that, but you don't really know how good that fits under sustainable development, which is their mission. And so another thing they do is a lot of education. And so you would think that education is obviously a contributor to sustainable development, but they've encountered problems even in that aspect, as the students that they have in these classes want to learn English, but the reason why they want to learn English a lot of times is to leave, to go to the West, or go to, there were a lot of signs in Punjab like, come study in the UK, come study in Australia. So that was a problem they encountered, was they found themselves just training these students to take the exam to study in a different country. And that is not in their mission for sustainable development in that area either. Another one that, I'm going to go back. Another of their programs that seems directly related to sustainable development on the surface is, or that seems non-controversial, is the empowerment of Punjabi women. But what if the women live in houses like this? So one woman that we knew through Educare's office, she would come to take classes. Her name was Harpal, and she lived in a relatively wealthy area in a house kind of like this one. And on the surface, you might think this isn't one of the women that you should be targeting for your women empowerment, especially your microlending programs for women. But talking to her, she lives in this house, but she's kind of trapped inside of it. She is lonely. Her husband works in a different country, and she just wants to do, she's bored, and she was telling us she wants to do something exciting like what we're doing, traveling to another country. And she wanted to take classes. When I was telling her about my college courses, she was like, well, I want to do that. But there's just no channel for her to do anything really other than just come visit the intern's office near where she lives. So I wouldn't call that empowered. But in this case, microfinance doesn't seem like the prudent tool to help her, because you should give your microloans to women who don't have access to finance, right? And isn't microfinance meant to be a tool for poverty alleviation? Oh. So the poorest, when you look around in the area, there are poor women, but the poorest communities there were actually the migrant communities that would come to Punjab to take advantage of the farmland. They would, the poorest women there were migrant women, but the traditional microfinance programs wouldn't really fit their lifestyles either, because these migrants would only stay for maybe a year or two. You never really knew how long they would be there, and their lifestyles were already sort of set on what their groups came there to do. So now let's move on to Educare's ingredients, or we could also call it capital in economics terms. You can divide it into financial, material, and human capital. And what I observed there was mostly deficiencies in human capital. As Julia mentioned, the organization is almost entirely run by these interns who would be there only max 2 years at a time. And this meant that they didn't have, and they were so young, often didn't have experience in what they were working on in India. And there was little continuity in the programs due to this. And they lacked specialized skills and local knowledge, including just knowledge of the language. So the story of microfinance in Educare began in just really recently in 2009. Some of the international interns were interested in microlending because they had studied it in school. And they proposed this project, and in 2010 it began, and in the beginning it did not have anything to do with the women empowerment initiatives in Educare. They were just finding individuals in the communities that seemed to seemed like good candidates for microloans. But this soon ran into financial difficulties because there wasn't really a systematic way they were doing this. Not only was the organization not sure they would have money to continue expanding the program, it wasn't there. The other members in the community would see that certain people were getting these loans, and there wasn't really an explanation for why some received the loans and others didn't receive them. So this was a problem. And so basically the microlending programs in EduCare sort of came to an end. After the interns left that were really into the program, the new interns that came weren't even hardly even told about it. So this ended. However, EduCare is still has the initiatives for women's empowerment and microfinance efforts to some degree. Their women's empowerment now is just focused on their girls' clubs, and these are in the rural villages where they just create a weekly institution for the girls to get together and have their space, as Julia was saying, and then that's entirely separate from what they do with microenterprise, and they have plans to be in savings groups in the migrant communities that they have the longest term relations with. So you can see that it's kind of a division between women's empowerment in the villages and the microfinance part over in the migrant communities. And you can see from the pictures that here the finance part maybe isn't as needed as on the right, comparing the living conditions to where these girls are. So by the end of this, I had some conclusions. Given their limited resources, considering their limited human capital, and considering where they are, I think that EduCare has been slowly adapting its microfinance strategy to fit its situation and circumstances. In general, from what I was reading before I went there, the academic papers and literature emphasize what the model is, like what the specific successful models for microfinance are, but they underemphasize the importance that a organization trying to do microfinance can adapt to where it is and to the resources it has and to its staff as well. Messy circumstances matter. I think it's important to question how microfinance can work in different places under different conditions. And it's about finding just the best fit. And finding the best fit has its own requirements. You need adaptability, which would require a staff that is actually there for years at a time and can learn from failures. So microfinance and women's empowerment should and will continue to be pursued, but the human element is very important in the pursuit of human development. And thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
Very brief, just about 10, 15 minutes. So please feel free to ask questions of our young students who have this. Any questions for? All right then. Yes.
This is sort of a joint question to the five of you. What experience did you have in India that was most memorable to you, and why?
Julia, would you stand here and reply so we can all hear you?
Sure. Let me think of it. So there were a lot. Is this on?
Yeah. Okay. But Martha kind of talked about one of the women we worked with. Her name was Harpal, and she had invited all of us over, all the interns, for dinner at her house. And it was a beautiful house. And she cooked this splendid meal, and she was talking to us. And she really she sat me down. She goes, "Julia, I will remember this night forever, and I will remember eating this dinner with you." And I just it was so important to her because she had recently suffered the loss of a child, and her husband was abroad, and she was one who was really struggling. And just to know that I did have a little bit of an effect in um, her life, so that was really an incredible experience for me.
How old was she, this one? She said she was interested in education. And,
Yeah, yeah, I think 25, that age. Yeah, so yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful woman.
I think for me, one of the most memorable moments was with my host family. Auntie Bhagwan was extremely kind to me, extremely accommodating. I couldn't for the life of me eat with my hands very well, and she made sure there was a fork for me, and she always helped me rip up the bread because I wasn't very good at it. And she and her husband had 2 young sons in the U.S. They had been there for 10 years. They went to college there, and they met their wives there, and their kids grew up there. And she told me that she thought it was highly unusual that, in this huge big city, New Delhi, that this American student just happened to live in her house. And she told me that, I think it's karma. I think the reason why you're here right now is because in a past lives, we were together somehow. And I don't know. I'll always remember what that lady had to say to me.
So like everyone else has said, it's really hard to think about just one. But mine was fairly, the memory that comes to mind is really serious. It was one of the later interviews that I was conducting, and I was really nervous because it was talking about menstruation, and it was with all of these younger girls, and I was really nervous to talk about it because of the taboos that were surrounding it. And one of the things that ended up coming out when we were talking about communal bathrooms and if they had access to them was one of the women spoke up and said, we really need bathrooms because we don't have bathrooms, and when we have to go out to the jungle, they called that big open space the jungle. So when we have to go to the jungle to use the bathroom, we can only go in the morning or at night, and that causes a lot of problems. And there's been girls, 9-year-old girls in our communities who were sexually assaulted when they would go out to use the bathroom. And that really, really impacted me. I think it was really hard for me. I was just so astounded to sort of see and be speaking with people and having a normal conversation, but then hear things like that. And it was just so, the fact that they were willing to tell me, the fact that had happened, the fact that it was being addressed. And then I think the part that I even had more trouble kind of dealing with, but I was also very inspired by, was these women didn't even have community bathrooms, but every single time that I came to do interviews, they would always make sure that they got crackers or some chai, and they were always so generous and kind and warm. And some of the women, even after I left, they were like, "Can you come back? We wanted to give you something," and they gave me this little statue of it was resembling Indian gods and a bracelet, and it was just really such an inspiring experience for me to realize how people that had so little were willing to give so much, both in terms of what they shared and with actually finances too. I was very inspired.
Yeah. So for me, I had a couple of those small, nice, having a good host and something like that. The Dr. Reshma, she cooked gulab jamun for me from scratch. Unbelievable dessert. And another one, it became positive. At the time, it was not too fun. I went out one day, and my mom already knows where it's going. I went out one day, I was just a tourist, I was just gonna go walk on the street and just, be be myself and just, find something cool. So I ran into this random rickshaw driver who was sitting there, saw, some pale-skinned guy he could probably take advantage of. So he took him for a ride. We went pretty far. We were actually talking and things like that. Definitely got along well. And went to a store. Everyone told us about, getting, rickshaw drivers having these connections with stores and things like that. I connected with him, and I all went out the window. And I'll just leave it at this, that I've never been taken advantage of so badly. And it was not funny at the time, to be honest. I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. Here I was, I'm this 21-year-old guy. I could take care of myself and things like that. And I got owned that day. It was definitely an embarrassing call to mom that night. But it ended up coming, it was just a good lesson, and definitely a trip down humble lane. I knew I didn't have it all at that point. Yeah, so again, everyone.
Nader, don't play with that.
Good. So I mentioned everyone, who's been to India, they talk about bargaining and these tips that you should keep in mind. And my parents are from the Middle East, and it's a very similar thing. So I thought I was used to it. Just holding your gun. We were just talking about this before. So the rickshaw driver had this connection. No wonder we drove so far. It's because he knew this guy at some really nice silk shop. So silk shops are amazing. I wish I had a picture of it here. But they just have tons of silk just stacked on there. Beautiful setting. They sit you down on these plush couches. They stand on the couches and they're just picking silk, just throwing it at you. And when they put it at your feet, it's not like, do you want it kind of thing. It's like if it's there and you don't throw it back to them, that means you're getting it. So they show you a ton of these silk, and it's beautiful, and they serve you, any refreshment that you want. And it's an experience going to shopping and things like that. I definitely next time would go with a local. And actually another cool thing that came about that experience was that when I got back, and because at first I literally thought it was a mistake because I checked my credit card online, and I literally thought, no, there's a mistake going on. There's no way I spent that much. So I showed it to the people I was working with. I was like, oh my God, there's no way it's not humanly possible to spend that much. So we went back to the store. I felt awful after. We went back to the store, and I had actually spent that much money. Very embarrassing at the time, but the care that they showed for me after that was unbelievable. So at the store, they believed me in thinking that, you would be more responsible than this. But when we got back and they saw I was distraught at that point, I could not hold my head up. I was just so embarrassed, and I felt so vulnerable. And they were so kind, and they picked me up, and they said, and they were very mad. It's to the point in our relationship where they were mad at me. Do not go out. Well, who are you thinking going out by yourself like that? We're here for you. You're supposed to take us out when you go shopping. We'll be able to bargain with you and things like that. And that was definitely a good pick me up. And in general, it was a good lesson. Probably want to take it easy on the credit card for the next couple of years to make up for that. But it was a good experience in the end. So.
Okay, one of my memorable experiences was from the first week there. I went with a couple of other girls to start up or see about starting up a girls' club again in a village nearby, and so we found a couple of girls who'd been in a girls' club before, and they decided to take us around to the houses of their friends that might be interested in joining. So we spent like a couple of hours just going around to different villages, and it was my first time in one of these really tiny rural villages. It's just so beautiful there. And in each house that we went to, the parents immediately sat us down in their sitting room, and we would start sort of translating with the girl, but none of us could speak the language of their parents at all. So in each house they came out with the tray of either Fanta. First it was Fanta in glasses, and second it was Limca in glasses. And then in another house we had chai. I think 2 more houses we had chai and cookies. So it was just such a hot day, so we were able to drink all of the beverages offered to us, and it was just a really good experience of the welcoming people there.
How do you guys choose? How do you find places to do interns? How do you choose your
It's really short, but okay. Martha and I found ours through idealist.org. I think it was a kind of cool thing, but I don't know, you guys have better one.
If you have international friends, you go and ask them, do you know somebody who's graduated from here? And if so, are they working and where are they working? That's how I found my connection. He was just a friend of a friend.
So I think my experience was a little bit different than other ones that were mentioned. I knew that I was really interested in the water crisis, and I actually had an assignment for a class that asked us to like kind of create a project. And so I did something relating to the water crisis. And then when I heard that this was an option where you could design your own you could self-design your own internship, I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to do something in that. So I really utilized Google and I typed in like pretty much non-governmental organization, water, and emailed like 60 different organizations, and then just kind of picked the one that worked best for what I was trying to do.
So like I mentioned, I got very fortunate. Ms. Loka Joseph kind of gave me the connection. There was a visiting scholar, Dr. Purnima, who was in the Women's Studies Department, and she had public health background. So they started the institute. I had personal contact. I don't know if anyone else had personal contact with the people they were talking to and setting up the project. So I was very fortunate in that I had a person there. But I did not originally, I kind of just thought the program would be cool to go to India and do research and get this kind of experience, which is what makes the fellowship so unique and valuable. So I didn't have any necessarily interest, but it became something that I very much enjoyed looking into.
One thing I can say is that, like, just researching online, there are a lot of programs that want to charge you a couple $1,000s in addition to your plane ticket to like experience volunteering in a certain country. And what I ended up doing in my trying to find a place was looking through just the list of partners that site for some of these programs and then emailing them individually, because when you just email them individually, they'd be like, oh yeah, of course you can come, no problem, without having to pay the thousands of dollars.
This has been really great for me, and I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Juan Cole and Zoka Joseph and everyone else in the Center for South Asian Studies who made this happen. You five have done something which I would not have done if the opportunity had presented itself when I was an undergraduate. It would have been so far out of my comfort zone that I wouldn't have even considered it. I commend you for doing what you did, and I think it's something that I feel whatever you do in your life after University of Michigan, you're going to be successful, and I think you're going to make the world a better place. And I hope this experience you had in India will be a lifelong impact on you. And certainly I feel humbled that, by spending a few bucks, I've given a chance for these 5 students and the students in the preceding 5 years to have, I hope, an experience of a lifetime. And it just makes me feel good.